some very important writers, Gore Vidal and people like that, were, big heavy hitters, came to the defense of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and argued that it was very original in terms of its use of fantasy, in terms of the setting and other things that they complimented Baum on. So, but Dina is absolutely right. Among the so-called gatekeepers of children's literature of the time, the children's librarians, some of the people involved in the publishing houses, they saw it as sort of subpar literature, as is kind of akin to Horatio Alger, Nancy Drew, or something like that.
Welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture podcast. I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and founder. Wherever you are listening, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, please do me a favor, make sure you're following the show and make sure that you rate and review us. It really means a lot, and it continues to allow me to get really exciting guests for the podcast and to continue delivering the podcast for free. Remember, though, we do have a Patreon, so if you don't want to listen to ads and you want to watch the video episodes of the podcast, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Do you know that there is a book club? It's free and virtual. So easy to just join the book club in your pajamas on a Sunday afternoon. Our next book club is June 22nd at 5 p.m. We are reading Sophie Gilbert's Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves. She writes for The Atlantic. She is such an amazing pop culture expert. So if you've always wondered, wait, why did the paparazzi harass Britney Spears like that? Or did the Spice Girls really have a love-hate relationship with each other? You're going to want to read this book. So to join the book club, email ivorytowerboilerroom@gmail.com and I will give you the Zoom link, June 22nd, 5 p.m. Without further ado, and a brief message of thanks. Thank you to Mary DePippi, the chief contributor, and Christian Garcia, who edits this podcast, and my fiance and parents, who continue delivering really creative ideas my way. And without further ado, here's today's episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is definitely for all you Oz fans, Wicked, Wizard of Oz, all things in the Oz universe. You're going to love this episode. And, if you don't think you're an Oz fan, hopefully this will convince you, because I have on two very exciting guests, both Dr. Mark West and Dr. Dina Schiff Massachi, who Mark is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and Dina is a lecturer in English at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So I'm sure they both know each other well. Maybe we'll hear a little backstory about how they both got involved to be co-editors of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is now released by Broadview Press in a really exciting illustrated type of edition. So welcome both to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. I'm just really curious. How did you both fall into The Wonderful Wizard of Oz? Like, what was your entry point with either the book, the MGM movie? Dina, if you want to start, like, how did this enter into your life?
Sure. So, growing up, I was obsessed with all stories that involved little girl goes on an adventure somewhere other than this world. And it just so happens that I have hair that kind of looks like Judy Garland's. So I dressed up as Dorothy every single Halloween when I was a kid. If they had gone with that blonde wig that they almost put Judy Garland in, I might not have been an Oz fan. So there's a fun little twist. And so my entry point was the film, and then I saw the Return to Oz 1985 weird, trippy Disney movie, bawled my eyes out that Bellina stayed in Oz. I could not understand why Dorothy would abandon her friend and leave her in Oz. Grown-up me feels very differently, but small me did not like that. And I didn't even know there were books until I was in high school. And then I started reading them, all of them. And I was kind of obsessed with the feminist elements. I was very into Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland at the time. And I was like, oh, I've seen this before, and ended up thinking that there was a connection and not doing anything with that until I ended up in grad school and was Mark's student.
Ah, okay. So this is how you both came together with all things Oz. How about you, Mark? When did you know about the Oz lore?
Well, I had a peculiar childhood. I grew up on the side of a mountain in Colorado in a very rural area, with an eccentric father who was very anti-television. So I grew up without a television. So I did not see the Wizard of Oz, the MGM movie, until I was a teenager. But one of the things that my father did, and it was very impactful on me in terms of my entire life, was that he read aloud to me and to my brother and my sister as well, um, aloud about 6 nights a week.
Hmm.
That was very important to me because I have dyslexia, which when I was a child made it difficult for me to read with any degree of confidence. But when my father read aloud, it helped me immerse myself in the story and really become engaged in the story and the characters and whatnot. And one of the stories that he read to us was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And then he also read the second book in the Oz books, The Marvelous Land of Oz. By that time, I was getting to the point where I could read on my own without having to have my father help me out in that regard. And so then I went on some years later and read the rest of the Oz books. Although I have to say that I think that the first two are the best two. But part of that might be because those were the ones that I associate with my father reading aloud. But when I became a teenager and got access to other people's televisions, because my father was not going to relent on this television thing, I started to see actually see the MGM movie. But most of my peers and certainly Dina started off with the movie and then went to the book, but I did it the other way around.
So what's so interesting is, Mark, you and Gregory Maguire have a really similar story because when he talks about the inspiration for Wicked and seeing Margaret Hamilton was, I think his family had to vote on a show to watch once a week. They could watch like one TV or one film. So that's how I think it was Oz during Easter. They
Mhm.
would or play it during holidays. So what I'm really just curious about is you both bring up such an interesting point um, in your introduction of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Broadview Press, which is so many people talk about L. Frank Baum. I know Dina uh, was on the American Oz PBS documentary. And I had like clipped out a section to share on social media where you talk about Baum's love of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. And I'm just curious, so many talk about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz as America's original fairy tale. And I was wondering what you both thought about the fairy tale element, like what Baum is doing, being such a lover of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Like, how does he create this in a very Americanized way? Like, why, it's not Hansel and Gretel, it's not Snow White, it's something very similar but different. Like, what are these parallel comparisons with fairy tales? So, Mark or Dina, whoever wants to jump in.
We'll start off with Dina.
Okay, so I'm kind of obsessed with the introduction of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And one of the things that I have said probably 100,000 times over all the semesters I have taught The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is you can't trust Baum with an adjective. So he calls the wizard wonderful, but then is the wizard wonderful? He calls the lion cowardly, but is the lion cowardly? So here's this introduction where he says, I'm going to do this new thing where all of the horrors and nightmares are going to be left out. but are they? Do we trust him at all? And so I think there's a certain amount that he's still playing with the older fairy tales. And I think taking something European and twisting it a little bit is very American. So that in of itself is an American trait. But the other thing that I always note is Baum wrote the first buddy tale. So I used to be able to talk about The Hangover. Now I think that's dated, but allow me to date myself. You could sort of pick any ridiculous buddy tale and it becomes, almost a one for one where this character can be Dorothy and this character can be the Tin Man. And so you don't have the romance and the social climbing that you have in a lot of the European fairy tales. Instead, it is about this community coming together to sort of overcome the challenges that they go through on the way. And I think that is part of what makes it very unique and American. And then you have the feminism. And I think that is part of what makes it very unique and uniquely, I don't want to say American because I don't know that that is a broad sweeping American trait, but modern, which is the other thing he sort of says, I'm going to make the modernized fairy tale. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
No, that's so interesting. Yeah. How about you, Mark? Is there anything else about the fairy tale?
Oh, sure. So Baum was interested in other Americans who were writing fantasy stories. And there were some, and we include a couple of the stories in the appendices of our edition of Wizard of Oz, Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Two examples that he names that he specifically mentions are Howard Pyle and Frank Stockton. But both Pyle and Stockton were they wrote fantasy for children before Baum did. But what they tended to do was try to write stories that felt like a European fairy tale. They were original stories, but they had that European, or in the case of Stockton, maybe almost a Middle Eastern sort of Arabian Nights kind of feel to it. One of the things that Baum did that I think is special is that he tried to give his Wonderful Wizard of Oz an American feel. And it isn't as if it's entirely detached from the European predecessor, things that came before, but it does feel American. It starts off, in a quintessential American setting, that being Kansas. And even when he has the characters go to to Oz, it has a kind of an American feel to it. It doesn't really feel like a European sort of feudalistic kind of world, like you would see in most fairy tales. So I think in that regard, he really did come up with something that was quite American in its ways. And I will pick up on exactly what Dina was saying. The influence that his mother-in-law, Matilda Gage, had on him was just astonishing, and really comes into play with her feminist views and her very famous book, which we excerpt in the appendices, Woman, Church, and State. She writes about how the Catholic Church in particular would present powerful women in the negative light of being witches. And she argues that, in fact, the treatment of so-called witches was really, in some ways, efforts to kind of keep women in their place. Well, Baum was very influenced by Matilda Gage, and we see in his portrayal of the witches in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, yes, there are wicked witches, but there are also good witches. And that's something that you wouldn't see very much of in a European fairy tale.
And if, those who are first reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, even the students you've taught over the years, and, so many probably they know the story, right? Like this is where I feel the American fairy tale element, it is really in our zeitgeist, or it's part of our cultural consciousness. Like even if you don't really, students now, some of them haven't watched The Wizard of Oz, but they know the lore. They know about Emerald City or the Wicked Witch. And I'm just curious, like what's going on in Baum's historic moment that makes its way in, both of your analyses. What makes its way into the Wonderful Wizard of Oz? Like, what is, you brought up his mother and her, feminist
Mother-in-law. Mother.
mother-in-law, thank you, and feminist beliefs. But how about anything else? Like, is there things with workers' rights? Um, the idea of the metropolitan versus the country, like Emerald City versus Kansas landscape. Like, is there anything else that you think is really interesting that you've both discovered over the years?
So, one thing that I'll put out there before we begin to answer this question is how much misinformation is out there about this exact topic.
I was recently watching Return to Oz and Nosferatu with my fiance, and I thought, wait, I just had on Broadview Press authors who wrote a vampire literature anthology and the iconic edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So I said to my fiance, you know what? I need to tell everyone who's listening to ITBR that BroadviewPress.com has everything from classic novels to discussions about vampire literature, vampires in film and TV, the philosophy of sports, Native American culture, horror. There is so much on Broadview Press's website. I urge you all right now, search broadviewpress.com. You will see that not only do they have books for college instructors, which if you do teach college, you better add them to your list because it's amazing, all the resources they have. But if you have just wandered around a bookstore or a library and thought, everyone always told me to read Moby Dick, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to fully understand it. Broadviewpress.com has you covered because they have amazing notes and sources to help you dissect that huge whale of a tale. See what I did there? I was just watching the Page Master, so there's a little Moby Dick reference. Head to broadviewpress.com, use the exclusive code they gave us, Ivory Tower, 20% off your entire order. Yes, your entire order. Enjoy your reading, and please reach out to me and let me know what you're reading from Broadview Press. I would love to share it on social media.
So, Henry Littlefield's rather famous parable on populism is false. It is proven false. One of the annotations that we actually have in the Broadview cites how this is false and how you can backtrack that and see exactly what Littlefield meant. He was a high school history teacher who made up this whole thing with his class that is the most miscited thing. So lots of people love to say, oh, Wizard of Oz, it is a parable for the populace. No, 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 no. So we know that Baum was influenced by his mother-in-law. We see that. In fact, we even see that with the use of color. The fact that he has his Glinda wearing white is a nod to the suffrage movement. And we know that he was influenced by the Chicago World's Fair and that architecture. We know that he bred fancy chickens. And so in the second Oz book, or second movie, third Oz book, where we have Belina the chicken show up, that is kind of a callback to his time breeding fancy chickens. We see his childhood home, Roselawn. So we see his time in Aberdeen in Kansas. So we see a lot of his life, but trying to read the politics of the time is very, very, very tricky, and one of those things that a lot of people have mucked up and gets misquoted. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. Well, and sometimes, right, like the way that Wizard of Oz, when I was an undergraduate, we actually analyzed the film through every literary theory. So like how would you see it through race studies or psychoanalytic studies, like Freud's unconscious, the id, the ego, the superego, queer studies? So like there definitely is a lot of angles in the film, maybe more so in the film than in the book. I'm not sure. But I do think the film, go ahead.
There's a ton you can do with the book. So one of the things we did with the Broadview edition is if you go through our annotations, we cite a lot of what has been written about Baum. So I know my students, the things that I always saw. One, someone was always afraid of the Munchkins, the flying monkeys, or both. I don't know why, but that was on the bingo card every semester it happened. Someone took my class, they had never been exposed to Oz. Every semester, I was like, really, you chose a whole class delving into this and you don't even know what the topic is? And that student always did it because they thought it would be an easy class. And while I was not teaching rocket science, so perhaps it was easier than a rocket science class, there was a whole lot of theory and, very high level written essays that we delve into that inevitably that student ended up kind of regretting this decision. And so we use that in these annotations. And so if someone is looking for how to kind of build a meatier class around Oz and do some deeper dives, the book takes you through all of those steps.
No, I love that. And I think as someone who has been embedded in Walt Whitman's psyche, and like I did a lot with Whitman and I've done queer poetry, like what's going on with desire in Whitman and Oscar Wilde. I always, and I'm sure you both, it sounds like I've gotten this question, is how the public really confuses an author's intentions and their themes with how we as a reader interpret, right? Like the way that we interpret Whitman or the way you interpret Baum's Oz doesn't mean that's what their conscious intention was. Like I just remember Margaret Atwood when she's ever asked if The Handmaid's Tale is a feminist book. She's like, consciously, I wasn't writing a feminist book, but if you all have now been seeing those themes, like that's you as a reader response. Like that's not, right? An author's intentions is a very different concept. But, like I'm just curious, like Dina and Mark, like L. Frank Baum himself, do you think he would be surprised that his Oz universe has now expanded into all things the Wicked franchise or, the way that it's been read so politically? Is that something that he would, I don't want to say be uncomfortable with, because, right, we can't necessarily ask him because sadly he's on the other side now. But like, did it really outlive, you think, even what his intentions were about the Oz universe? That it's still an ongoing conversation?
Something that Dina and I have talked about. One of the things that I think is remarkable about The Wizard of Oz is that L. Frank Baum, in creating the story, the world of Oz, these characters that resonate so deeply with us, he created a kind of a playground that others can, in fact, play in. One of the things, though, about Baum is that he did not fill in all the spaces. So there is room for others to kind of come up with their own take. And because if the book had been, especially the first book, had been more fleshed out, and maybe there wouldn't be so much room for people to feel like, well, I can put in my interpretation. There's something special. I don't know if it was intentional, but there's something special about the book that almost invites a kind of a participatory response. So you see that in all of the different incarnations, but those incarnations go back to the very days when Baum himself was alive. So when you look at the first theatrical productions based on Oz, well, those came out of Baum himself. But in fact, his his theatrical version of The Wizard of Oz was really much more of a vaudevillian sort of production than the book. So he himself was kind of going off in different directions in the spin-offs that he was involved in. And then when he became involved in movies back toward the end of his life, he moved to California and became involved in the production of movies. He turned to Oz again, but again, they are different from the book. So he himself realized that there's a lot you can do with Oz. And I think that's one of the appealing things about it. So if you want to give it a kind of urban slant, you can do that with The Wiz. If you want to give it a different kind of a slant, like Maguire does with Wicked, there's space to do it. I can't really think of another book that has brought about so many different interpretations and different versions and different takes than this story. It's a remarkable thing about it.
Yeah,
I'm going to riff off that a little bit, and I think what Mark is saying about Baum and kind of his theater career is very important to understanding. Baum's first love was theater. He was the wizard. He had all the costumes and all the props and all the magic of the stage rather than the actual magic that Glinda has. And something that is also important to note is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is the first book in a series. And this is a series that Baum tried to stop writing over and over and over again. And then he would bankrupt himself doing these fancy things with, making movies and whatnot, and go back to writing these books because they were making a whole lot of money. So I think he would love that this still exists. And he would love that it's been turned into all of these other iterations on film, on stage, in books, because ultimately that was a lot of what he was trying and sort of failing at. He had his slices of success, and then he had the things, even when they were successful, they'd bankrupt him.
Mm. Well, I'm curious because what I love about this edition is it includes all the original illustrations. And I remember as a boy when I discovered the movie, and then like everyone else's journey, I think I found a book called The Making of the Wizard of Oz, and then I realized that L. Frank Baum had like the series, so I started looking at all these illustrations. I'm just curious, did the illustrations inspire Baum's like either the theater productions of Oz, the silent film? Like, did the illustrations even inspire the MGM movie?
First, let's give a shout out to Broadview. We had to push a little bit to get those color illustrations, and they rolled with it. So thank you, Broadview, for letting us do that. Yeah. I don't think they've ever done a book like this with all of these illustrations before. So we really owe a big thanks to our editors for that.
Yes. No, this is wonderful, and it's needed, definitely needed. Summer's almost here, and as a lover of literature, bookstores, libraries, the constant question I get is, Andrew, what book should I add to my summer reading list and read at the beach this summer? And I just always had a problem trying to tell people what to read, but guess what? No more. I have a magazine that has become my best friend. It is the G&LR, the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi-monthly magazine of all things LGBTQ arts and culture. Their current issue is called The First Homosexuals, and it is guest edited by Dr. Jonathan D. Katz, who is a professor at the University of Penn. He was the founding president of New York's Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, which, if you've never been there, is a free museum. So definitely go there. It's in Soho, and it's amazing. Back to the G&LR. This new edition is so exciting to read. It looks at how the term homosexuality is an invented term. It was invented by medical scientists in the late Victorian period. So I can't wait to read all of these articles, but there's articles talking about homosexuality in Japan, Russia, Canada, Paris, India, Argentina. And Jonathan D. Katz talks about his exhibition called The First Homosexuals, now on display in Chicago's Wrightwood Museum from May 2nd to July 26th. But I can't get to Chicago this summer, so I'm so happy that I get to look through the magazine and see all of the articles that Jonathan has put together with contributing writers. I'm interviewing Jonathan soon, so look out for that episode, everyone. The GNLR has given me an exclusive promo code. Write it down, everyone. It's ITBR Choice, and you get a free issue with your subscription. So, glreview.org, go to the subscribe section, ITBR Choice, you get a free issue, and I can't wait for you all to enjoy the GNLR as much as I do. Please let me know if you're reading the GNLR, and until next time when I have Jonathan D. Katz on.
The relationship that Baum had with Denslow was interesting, complicated, and messy. So for, Denslow, before Baum wrote Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he wrote a couple of children's books that both had geese in their name. So there was Mother Goose in Prose and Father Goose. And Denslow was involved in the illustrating of one of those books. But Denslow and Baum worked together, and the decision to lavishly illustrate the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is something that the publisher did not initially support because it was so expensive. It was technically possible, but to have that much color in a book was something that really drove up the production costs. But it was something that Denslow and Baum were both committed to, and they both put some of their own financial resources into making that happen. So they really saw themselves as kind of like a team in the beginning, and then they had a horrible falling out. But I think in the initial book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the illustrations were things that Baum himself had input in, and it was something that he cared about. In the subsequent Oz books, they moved to another illustrator. It has a completely different feel to it. It looks kind of 1920s flapper girl type look in terms of Dorothy and the female characters. It just doesn't look like Denslow's very practical kind of farm girl look to it. But Baum was always very visual. He always thought about the way things looked. And so to that extent, I do think that the illustrations probably played a role in his approach to building the Oz universe.
Yeah. And I'm just curious, like, even the illustration that like fascinates me is the one with the monkeys. And I'm curious, like, the one monkey's wearing this like hat. Do either of you know why the monkey is wearing a like marching band type of hat?
I don't have a fabulous answer for that. It might be to kind of call up the Golden Cap a little bit, but what I know is a lot of the illustrations, both Denslow and John R. Neal, who Mark was alluding to as the second illustrator, they had to create so many and kind of so quickly that sometimes they'd repurpose something that they had somewhere else, and especially John R. Neal. So this might not work so well with your monkey and the cap, but sometimes when you see something and it doesn't quite fit, that is the answer. Other times, the illustrations flesh out some of what is not said. So John R. Neal's Dorothy is blonde. Denslow's Dorothy is brunette. Neither one contradict Baum. Like Mark was saying earlier, Baum really kind of leaves things up for interpretation. So there's a lot of wiggle room, and certainly the artists kind of fill it in. And for Neal, that worked for a long, long time. In fact, later on, he ended up writing some books in the series himself. if you go all the way to the famous 40.
Mm.
It did not work as well for Denslow. What they ended up kind of breaking up over was the stage show. Denslow was in charge of the costumes, and they were arguing over royalties and kind of who was doing the most work. So, how much Denslow and whatever additions he made were appreciated, we could question that a little bit.
Yeah. So when did L. Frank Baum, uh, like how much time was there between his death and then when the MGM movies made?
20 years. Uh,
Okay.
L. Frank Baum died in 1919 in California, and the movie came out in 1939. Um, so there was an interval of time. Of course, in terms of the time between the publication of the book, which came out in 1900, and the release of the movie, which came out in 1939, it's pretty close to 40 years. But Baum had, he didn't really live that long of a life, all in, by modern standards. He certainly didn't have a long life, but he did a lot of work, and Dina's kind of alluding to it. He did it pretty quickly. So one of the things about Baum is that he kind of dashed things off. If you look at all of the things that he wrote, we tend to think of him first and foremost with The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And then we think about the other Oz books that he wrote. But if you take a look at all the books that he wrote a whole bunch of books under different pseudonyms. He wrote a bunch of series books. He wrote books under female pseudonyms, which I thought was interesting. But he wrote other fantasy stories, some of which are completely different in tone from the Oz books. They're a little bit more almost mystical in their feel to them. Um, but I think one of the problems with Baum is that when authors write really fast, they sometimes just don't polish things up. They let mistakes stand. I mean, one of the classic mistakes that Baum made, I presume it was a mistake, I don't think he did it on purpose, is that in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, as Dina alluded to, the Emerald City is based in part on the Chicago World's Fair, which Baum had gone to any number of times. And he was intrigued by the kind of almost set-like quality to the pavilions that were gleaming white, but they were all kind of temporary buildings built to show, but not to last. Um, and so in the book, of course, when they approach the Emerald City, it's not emerald at all. It's a big hoax. They have to wear green goggles, so kind of steampunkish in the illustrations. And then it makes everything appear to be green. You just have to go into the next Oz books, and now Emerald City is emerald. They just only painted it green. You think, well, Baum, you wrote that. Not that much time has passed. Don't you remember? It's white, but apparently maybe he decided he just didn't want to go with that anymore.
That is funny. And like something that I'm interested in too is how was Baum received? Like how was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz received by other American writers? Like were there other writers who were really, was this a spectacular hit? Was Edith Wharton like, "Oh, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I'm going to give this to like my cousin's children," or how did he fall in the canon of American authors at that turn of the century time?
So you bring up an interesting disconnect between public perception and how others feel about, I'm going to say, children's literature and series literature, because Oz falls under both. And, libraries, academics, etc., tend not to love children's literature and series literature. And so Oz was banned for a number of years. Especially libraries in particular didn't like carrying it. One of the reasons why is it's a big series. What if one book goes missing? Now we have to reorder that. I'd rather just have the one that I have to keep track of than, all of these. But so far as public perception, I mean, this was kind of the Christmas gift every year. And Baum would write, especially toward the end of his life, he was writing one a year. And every year that was the gift kind of everyone was fighting over for Christmas. If I'm going to date myself again, but Harry Potter. This was very, Harry Potter-esque with your Barnes and Noble midnight openings to get the book before all your friends. And so it depends what you mean by public perception. It took a while before it was written about with scholarship. It We kind of go through this history a bit in the Broadview and trace it just a bit.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, one of the things that we see is that the book was loved by the public a lot, and in the series as a whole was. The demand for the series never fell off very much. So, sometimes you'll have a book in a series that's really hot for a little while, but then 10 years later, nobody's reading it anymore. It just kind of falls off the radar screen. But The Wizard of Oz stayed on the radar screen for a long time, and it's still on the radar screen. So it's become part of our cultural baggage in a way. But one of the things that I've noticed, and we do comment on this in the introduction, is that some very important writers, Gore Vidal and people like that, were big heavy hitters, came to the defense of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and argued that it was very original in terms of its use of fantasy, in terms of the setting and other things that they complimented Baum on. So, but Dina is absolutely right. Among the so-called gatekeepers of children's literature of the time, the children's librarians, some of the people involved in the publishing houses, they saw it as sort of subpar literature, as kind of akin to Horatio Alger, Nancy Drew, or something like that.
What does Sunset Boulevard, The Sound of Music, Vertigo, Snow White, The Wizard of Oz, and even Rebecca have in common? They've been covered on my friend Christian Garcia's podcast called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Every time he is researching and deep diving a film with his guests, he asks the question, what's so queer about this film? You're going to love his podcast. You can listen to it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and follow him on Instagram and TikTok at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do.
Well, it's also why Baum had so many pen names. The publisher wouldn't let him publish everything under his own name because they knew then that people wouldn't buy it. It would be too saturated a market. So he had to compete against himself as these other people, and it's fun to play the how progressive is Baum with the female pen name, but some of what he's writing under his female pen name is a marketing ploy.
That's interesting. And, was there, again, Baum wasn't alive when the MGM movie came out, but what's fascinating to me is that movie holds so much nostalgia for so many of different generations. And the Technicolor introduction, just the whole sordid controversy of the film being made. Is there anything, though, in the movie, like just in both of your opinion, as those who are so close to the Oz lore, literature, scholarship, is there something that you think Baum would have had an issue with in the film, or might even just have diverged a lot from his intention of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz?
So Baum would have loved the theatricality. And I think one of the things that MGM does that's very interesting is that they make the Wicked Witch of the West the primary antagonist. She only shows up in one chapter in the book. She is not out to get Dorothy. Dorothy wanders into her land, and then she's like, this little girl's crossed over into my border. I better get her now. Where in the movie, every action is really, she's behind it, and it's this whole kind of Wicked Witch of the West versus Glinda, which the film also takes two good witches and pops them together into one. So we've gone from this very balanced version of witchcraft that Matilda Gage talks about in Woman, Church, and State to this kind of tilted, skewed version of witchcraft. And I think the film is less feminist. I think Judy Garland's Dorothy has less agency. I think the fact that the Wicked Witch of the West is very European, old school, villainous witch, I'm not sure that Baum would have loved that. But the fact that it's so popular, the fact that Margaret Hamilton, sort of changed how witches are in film forever after that, it's hard to say because he was an actor, and I think he would have appreciated those things too.
Mhm. Mm.
You think, to pick up on what Dina was just talking about, I don't think he would have liked what MGM did with the character of Dorothy, because he set out to create, and he did in fact create, a girl character who kicks butt, a girl character who goes on a quest, a girl character who is not intimidated by things, a girl character who functions in a leadership role. Remember, in the book, even though Dorothy has male companions, when it comes to who speaks for the group, who makes the decisions, she leans on her advisors, her entourage, but in the end, it's her decision. She's in charge. She's the person who is making the decisions. And what ends up happening in the film version, especially the end of it, where Dorothy's imprisoned in the castle in Winky Country. Really, the film people have added this whole damsel in distress subplot that is just nowhere near the book. It's just not in the book at all. And I think Baum, given his feminist inclinations, would not have wanted Dorothy to be turned into a damsel in distress. So I don't think he would have liked that. But like Dina said, he liked big productions. We know he liked music. We know he liked dance. We know he liked elaborate stages for a little while before when he had a little theater for a while. And one of the things that he was famous for in this play that he wrote was this very elaborate stage with lots of, set with all these mechanical pieces, something I think that Maguire picks up on in Wicked. Maguire knows a lot about Baum, and it's clear that he drew on some of those things about Baum that not everybody knows.
Wait, I'm going to change my answer. Baum would hate that Oz was a dream in the MGM film.
Yes.
I will die on that hill. Baum would hate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I feel like by having it a dream, it really does, in a way, take away from the reality of her, like, Bildungsroman journey, in a way. It's kind of just like, well, that's where the psychological reading comes in. Oh, this was just displaced thoughts, or every person is based off of an archetype from her real life. Miss Gulch as the witch, Auntie M maybe Glinda type surrogate. But like that's what's interesting is like, have both of you then seen the Wizard of Oz musical live or any type of production when it's been performed?
So, yes, but before I answer that, you know that the um, characters being people from her life comes from the Larry Siemens silent film that
Ah,
predates the MGM film. It's terrible. I don't recommend watching it at all, but that is where it comes from.
okay. Um, so like when you've seen the musical, like what's interesting is sometimes now casting directors really like to cast Annie M and Glinda, or the witch, right? Of course, in Miss Gulch, that's like an easy one because of Margaret Hamilton. But like these foils of each other. Um, but is there, as we're nearing the end of our time, I think what's fascinating is, like you've said, Baum didn't just write this, like he's written so much. But you brought up Return to Oz, which I would not do my job justice, Dean, if I didn't talk about it, because I think it's such a fascinating film by Disney. It's so gothic, so, talk about psychological. She's, being treated at the beginning with her hallucinations, they think. And it's disturbing too. Um, right? Who's the character where she like um is headless and she puts on all the different women's heads?
So here's what I find fascinating
Yeah.
about this. And if you're bored, I think somewhere floating on YouTube is a video I did for the International Wizard of Oz Club about this topic.
Okay.
But all of the things that people claim are horrifying from Return to Oz that happen in Oz. So in our world, there's this whole scene where Dorothy gets electric shock treatment. Baum would not have touched that with a 10-foot pole. But the witch who changes heads, who in the film is Mombi, in the book is Languidir, who is in the third book. The Gnome King is in the third book, and kind of his gnomes and the spies. And a lot of these pieces come from Baum. But what Baum was into is he introduced something that was a little bit scary and then kind of make it funny and poke fun at it. So this goes back to The Wicked Witch of the West is only in one chapter. And his Wicked Witch of the West has three braids and they're sticking up, and she has an eye patch, and she's afraid of the dark, and she's afraid of water, and she's afraid of Dorothy. You know, she's not meant to be this big, bad, scary thing. It's Baum kind of saying to the kid, there's no monster under your bed. Come look.
Mm.
And so he has the Wheelers, but his Wheelers aren't scary. They're kind of ridiculous. They start off trying to scare Dorothy, and then within 2 pages, you're like, this is silly, not scary. You know, his Gnome King, he equates to Santa Claus. And in both the book and the movie, he's taken down by eggs, which are the ultimate symbol of female fertility. Thank you, Matilda Gage. You know, so there are all these little ways he takes it and breaks it. And the Disney film is terrifying. And it has all these jump cuts and it's trying to make it real. And it feels much more like a horror movie. So I think if you want to talk about movies I don't think Baum would like, that one is up there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Baum liked humor. One of the things that we know about Baum is he did like humor. There's humor in every book that he wrote. Um, Sometimes it's slapdash humor, sometimes it's more satirical, but it's always there. Um, and I think Dina's exactly right. He would undercut that which is scary with a little touch of humor. One of the things that Dina and I have talked about is the surprising record that Disney has in terms of trying to take, Disney acquired the rights to a number of the Oz books, but Disney himself and the Disney production company post Disney never really had a smash hit with Oz. They tried over and over again, but they never really had something that could be considered akin to the MGM Oz thing. They tried, but they really weren't able to do it. I think one of the things that I've thought about in terms of this is that Disney himself was very good at Americanizing European fairy tales, but he wasn't so good at dealing with a fairy tale that was already American. His toolbox really just wasn't really set up for that.
Mm.
Didn't you have a book you and Kathy did, and I wrote a chapter on this exact thing?
Yeah. So yeah, we done a number of things about Disney and the stories and whatnot, and turning stories into movies, and Disney as a reader and then a storyteller. And yeah, you did write an excellent chapter on that very topic. Yeah.
Mm. So, my final question just is how how do you both think um The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, like something you both have learned after reading this book or the series? Like what some positive, it could be positive, maybe it's something controversial, but I'm assuming it's going to be positive. What's something that you've carried from Baum's writing that has helped inform both of your lives?
So my favorite Oz book, I think, some days it's different, but I really like the sixth Oz novel, The Emerald City of Oz, which Baum definitively tried to stop the series with. If you look at the last chapter, it's a whole like, you will never hear from me again. And then the seventh book comes out a few years later. That's its own story. But the way he meant to end this series at one point, Oz becomes this amazing feminist socialist utopia.
Mm.
And the rightful ruler of Oz is this character Ozma, who we meet in the second Oz book. But we don't meet her as Ozma, we meet her as this little boy named Tip. So in some ways, Baum wrote the first transgender character in American literature. It's very Virginia Woolf's Orlando, except it predates Virginia Woolf's Orlando. So someone out there should have a lot of fun writing that paper after hearing this podcast. And this kind of transgender character is the rightful ruler of Oz, and under her rulership, Oz becomes this perfect world. And so Baum ends up having to look outside of Oz to find problems because he solved all of Oz's problems. And every book afterward, pretty much, you see the bad guys come from outside of Oz. And so in the sixth one, it's all the bad guys from everywhere else team up to fight this wonderful little girl ruler who manages to overpower them. I won't spoil how, but with one of these contrived magical things that she doesn't have to go to war, there's no violence. And what's really fascinating, if you go back to Gage, is this is Baum actualizing a chapter we didn't get to use with Matilda Gage's Woman, Church, and State. She has the first chapter in that book, she traces every single matriarchal society that has ever existed and what they looked like. And he's sort of just like, all right, I'm going to take this idea from there and that idea from there, and boom, look, Oz is that now. And I think that's really cool. And I think a lot of what he does with what a rightful ruler is, we should all be taking some notes, maybe.
Yes. Nice, nice modern contextual analysis there. So thank you, Dina. And then how about you, Mark? What's something that you've learned from Baum's universe?
Well, one of the things that people assume in the world of children's literature is that boys will read books about boys and girls will read books about girls, and that it's has this kind of rigid gender divide in terms of how children's books in particular are marketed and how they're perceived. But one of the things that I really liked about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and I continue to like about it, is that Baum kind of blew that apart. So when I was a kid and my father read this aloud, I had no trouble identifying with Dorothy. Dorothy seemed a character that I liked, and there was something about Dorothy, her gumption, her resistance to feeling intimidated appealed to me. And I think one of the things that I think Baum should be credited for is creating a children's book that has a girl character that doesn't just appeal to girls, it also appeals to boys. Now, one of the things that people argue, and I'm straight and I don't really know fully exactly the magical alchemy involved in this, but there's something else about the Oz, maybe the movie more than the book. I think Dina has written about this, that also appeals to gay people in ways that I don't fully understand, but it's obviously there. There's a special quality to this story that appeals to people from all different kinds of backgrounds, and feel as if they have a place. They have a place in this world. And that's a remarkable accomplishment. I can't think of very many other children's authors that have created a world where everybody feels like I have a place in this world. Kudos to Baum for doing that.
Yes.
I do think that that is Baum, and I think it's that he's creating a safe place for non-traditional characters. So if you think about every character Dorothy picks up, none of them are conventional. None of them are the prince with the sword ready to save her from the tower. Sorry, MGM. And they're still accepted and loved and taken on the journey with her anyway. And it gets more intense as the series goes on, but I think that in of itself is a huge part of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm a friend of Dorothy. That's the, queer connection to all things Oz. So this has been so wonderful. Please, everyone out there, get your hands on The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, co-edited by Mark West and Dina Schiff Massachi. And it's on broadviewpress.com. Use the code ITBR20 for 20% off. And I'm so excited for everyone out there to get their hands on this wonderful edition. Thank you so much to Dina and Mark. I had such a fabulous time with you two.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you,
Thank
Andrew.
you. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.